I've gone back and forth about sharing this because, well, it wasn't my experience, at least not directly, but it certainly shaped my mother in ways that I still see today. And she told it with the same steady, matter-of-fact tone for, well, as long as I can really remember. There's no embellishing, no dramatics. She's the most literal, no-nonsense person that I know of. So when she repeats it, I take it seriously. She grew up in a house where every day felt like walking past an open flame. Her father was violent, unpredictable, and completely unrestrained when people weren't watching. She was small, 5 maybe, when things reached their worst too. After one especially brutal night, she crawled into a narrow space behind a dresser in her bedroom, a little hideaway that she started using whenever she needed to disappear. That's where she first noticed that she wasn't alone. She said that she didn't see anything at first, just heard a quiet shifting sound, almost like fabric brushing against furniture. Then a figure eased into the dim sliver of light that leaked through the crack behind the dresser. It wasn't a child, but it wasn't really an adult either. She described it as thin and slightly stooped, like someone who had been living in too small of a space for too long. Its face didn't look monstrous or anything, nothing like that, just tired, creased in ways that a young child wouldn't have the vocabulary to describe, except that it looked worn out. It didn't say a name, it didn't call itself a friend, it just asked my mother in a quiet, careful voice why she always hid there. From that night on, the figure appeared whenever she was frightened and vanished whenever anyone else entered the room. Sometimes she would draw pictures and it would tilt its head and point at things it liked. Sometimes she would whisper about what had happened that day, and it would listen without interrupting. Other times, she claimed it would wordlessly gesture for her to stay close, especially when she wandered too far from home. She never saw it walk through solid walls or anything like that, but she did say that it had a habit of slipping into the thin gap under her bed, pressing itself flat in a way that didn't seem physically possible. When she crawled under there afterward to look, nothing was ever waiting. No exit, no hole, no sign anyone had even been there. For years she assumed that it was an imaginary friend that she had built to survive the constant terror of her home life. She didn't like talking about it once she grew older as well, but the part that she cannot explain is what forced them to leave the house. So one evening, my grandmother walked past my mother's door and heard her talking in a soft, secretive way that kids do when they think that they're safe. She was responding to someone, not unusual for a child, except the reply wasn't in her voice. It was lower, older, calm but clear enough that my grandmother stopped mid-step because she knew exactly what an adult man's voice sounded like through a closed bedroom door. She threw the door open, and of course the room was empty, except for my mother sitting cross-legged on the floor with a book in her lap. My grandmother didn't ask any questions. She told my mother to pack a bag, and by morning they were gone. My mother says that the figure appeared only once more, later that same night, after she'd been told that they were leaving. It was crouched near the foot of her bed, not angry and not shouting, but just watching her with this expression that she never forgot. Something halfway between disappointed and sort of resignation. She remembers it saying that she shouldn't talk about it again, not to anyone, and then slipped into the shadow beneath the bed frame and didn't return. She's in her 60s now and still says that she sometimes misses the feeling of not being alone, even though she has no idea what that thing really was. A coping mechanism, a dissociative hallucination, something stranger but still rooted in reality. I don't know. What I do know, though, is that my mother does not make up stories, and she never described it in a way that suggested magic or monsters, just a strange presence that stepped in during a time when nobody else would. I'm not trying to label it too, I'm only wondering if anyone else here has heard of children, especially traumatized ones, encountering something that behaves this way. quiet, watchful, protective in its own unsettling manner, and gone forever the moment that an adult becomes aware. This happened when I was very young, maybe around 6. My parents were splitting up, unfortunately, and everything in my life felt unsteady and confusing at the time. My mother had to stay somewhere else for a while, and she thought that it would be better if I lived with my grandmother until things calmed down a bit. I remember that time really clearly too. Not because anything good was happening, but because it was the first period in my life where I felt truly disposable. Kids at school could smell it on me too. They said things like, "Nobody wants you," and at that age, you don't know how to shield yourself from that kind of poison. You just sort of swallow it. My grandmother tried so hard to make things feel like normal. She'd tuck me in early, put the radio on low, keep the hallway lights going so that I wouldn't feel alone, and that house always felt safe to me. Well, until one night when it no longer did. I woke up to a sound that I still hear perfectly in my memory. It wasn't loud and it wasn't even human. It was strange, wet, like a dragging inhale, like someone trying to breathe through a broken windpipe or something. At first, I thought my grandmother was having trouble sleeping and had gotten out of bed and was struggling to breathe. But when I blinked my eyes open, the room was completely dark, except for a dim crack of hallway light under the door, and someone or something was sitting right beside me. I could make out the shape by the way that it blocked the light, and it was a slouched figure, knees pulled close, its head bent in an angle that no person could comfortably hold. Its hair was long enough to pull onto the blanket, but the strands looked wrong. It was stiff and thick, not like human hair. It reminded me of a woman only in the way that a scarecrow vaguely resembles a man, I suppose. Similar shape, but really nothing else. I didn't move. In fact, I didn't even breathe. I didn't even cry, though everything in my body wanted to. Its face was so close that I could see the faint outline of its jaw moving, opening and closing in tiny jerks, almost like it was whispering to itself. The sound it made wasn't words, though, just this awful mumbling that kept scraping the edges of the room. I curled one arm underneath the blanket and reached for my grandmother beside me, desperate for her to wake up, and when my fingers touched her forearm, something slick and warm smeared across them. I panicked and shook her harder, thinking that she was bleeding, but she didn't move, not even a twitch. That was the moment that I truly thought that I was dead. I shut my eyes and whispered whatever prayers that I could remember, and after a while, maybe a minute, maybe 10, the whispering stopped. The air shifted like someone stepping away from the bed, and when I finally forced myself to look, the shape was gone. The room looked normal again, and my grandmother was breathing softly, seemingly completely unaware of what had just been sitting beside us. I must have fallen asleep at some point from exhaustion, I would guess, but in the morning I wrapped my arms around her and asked if she remembered anything from last night. She said gently, "Sweetheart, you slept in your room last night. I never came in." I tried arguing with her desperately, and I told her that she had, that we had gone to bed together, that I'd touched her arm, and she brushed it off kindly, the way that adults do when they think that a child just had a vivid nightmare. But I wasn't convinced, because when I reached into my pockets later that day, I found several long, wiry sort of strands of hair or something like that, curled up in a little knot, and they were definitely not mine. In fact, again, they didn't even look human. They were not hers either, that much was clear. But that wasn't the last strange thing that I experienced in that house, because sometimes I would hear someone call my name from the back hallway or the kitchen from time to time. It was always soft, like trying not to startle me, and it always sounded a little bit like my grandmother, and every time that I would answer, there would be no one there. After the third or maybe the fourth time, she told me calmly, without fear but with certainty, don't answer a voice unless you can see who it belongs to. I didn't understand then, but I think I do now. Some things imitate familiarity because it's the easiest way to get a reaction out of you. As for the sound that night, the one that the creature kept repeating, I've never been able to find a meaning for it. I know that it wasn't a word in English or any language that I've really looked up. Sometimes I tell myself that it didn't mean anything and it was just noise. But truthfully, I have no idea what that was. I never used to think much about the woods behind my friend Mason's neighborhood. They were sort of just, well, there. A strip of dark trees bordering a quiet cul-de-sac in rural South Jersey. The kind of place that kids dared each other to run through on Halloween, as we always did. Honestly, I lived in that area for years and I barely glanced at them. But one late spring evening in 2020, right after the school shut down, those woods stopped being background scenery, and instead they became the center of one of the strangest, most unsettling things that I've ever experienced. Something that has grabbed hold of me in the years since then too, no matter how many times I've tried to rationalize it. So, when lockdown first hit, I spent most of my days at Mason's place. There really wasn't much else to do, and his house sat on a block that looped around like a rectangle, all modest homes in close neighborhoods, and behind it, there was a wall of trees stretching for miles. There was only one legitimate trail back there, a narrow strip of beaten dirt leading to a separate neighborhood, but people mostly ignored it. One night, after we had exhausted video games and bored conversation, we wandered outside for a bit. I had been messing around with an old skateboard in his garage earlier that day, and wanted to try the slight incline at the far end of the block. The fog was now clinging low to the ground, every porch light looked swallowed by it, and as we walked I noticed a thin opening between two fences at the end of the street, a small, barely visible passage disappearing into the trees. I asked Mason about it, and he shrugged. I think it's just a shortcut to the old trail, he said. I go back there sometimes. I didn't think much of it at the time. The skateboard won that night, and after a spectacularly ungraceful fall, I walked away with a cracked wrist and a very bruised ego. Well, the next evening, wrist in a brace, curiosity about the path got the better of me, and I brought it up again. This time, we grabbed a flashlight and we headed out. It had rained earlier that day, so there was some wet bark and mud around. We didn't turn on our lights until we passed the last houses though, not wanting to look suspicious or like we were going to rob someone or something. And what happened next? It still does not make any sense to me. The trail was narrow but clear at first, flattened leaves, old footprints, occasional beer cans from bored teenagers. But we were not content staying on the main path, and so when we reached the fork leading toward the other neighborhood, we stupidly cut left, directly into unmarked woods. The canopy, it swallowed the light almost immediately too. The deeper that we went, the quieter everything became. Even the hum of the nearby roads vanished, replaced by a thick, expectant stillness. After maybe 5 minutes, there was a sharp crunch breaking through the trees ahead of us. Heavy, deliberate, like someone stepping onto a pile of sticks and jumping on them. We froze, shined our lights forward, but there was nothing. Not even the sound of an animal running off. No shifting branches, and just the echo of that noise sitting in the air like a held breath. It was probably a deer, Mason whispered, though he didn't sound convinced either. We angled away from the sound, stumbling through the soggy underbrush. But a few minutes later, it happened again, directly in front of us now. Somehow, even though we had changed direction. It was the same sound, same empty beam of light revealing absolutely nothing. A thin drizzle began falling through the trees now. My shirt slowly dampened, the temperature dropped a bit, and that creeping awareness, that sense that we were no longer alone, settled into my gut. We should head back, I murmured, and for once, Mason didn't argue. Retracing our steps was harder than expected. Everything looked the same in the dark. Fallen logs, clusters of bushes, the vague outline of the trail. But when we finally stumbled back onto the actual path, I felt a momentary rush of just relief, really. That was, until we heard it again. This time, it was directly behind us. A steady rhythm of footsteps, and they were getting quicker. We broke into a fast walk now. The rain intensified, masking smaller noises, but the crunching, it didn't stop. It grew louder, sharper, closer, and I forced myself to look over my shoulder. 4 separate beams of light, flashlights, were now weaving between the trees, coming directly toward us. "Run," I whispered, and I didn't need to say it twice. We sprinted blindly through the dark, branches whipping my arms, my brace slamming against my side. The trail exit should have been obvious, but we blew right past it, apparently, and ended up at a 6-foot fence behind one of the houses. It was a dead end. My bad wrist throbbed just looking at it, and there was really no way over. The woods behind us suddenly went silent, though. No footsteps, no more lights, just rain tapping on leaves. We hesitated for maybe 2 seconds, long enough for me to feel the first flicker of hope. I mean, maybe whoever that was gone. But then, my flashlight caught movement behind Mason. Those beams, they reappeared, flickering through the trees and coming quickly now. This time, though, they didn't turn or hesitate. They moved with purpose, straight down the trail and straight toward us. We ran again and began climbing over this fence, even though I could barely make it over. We burst through the first exit, stumbling onto asphalt, lungs burning. Mason followed a moment later. He had actually helped me get over the fence. But he was walking like he thought that we'd outrun whatever was back there. I hissed at him to move quickly, but before he could, those lights, they broke over the fence line. There were 4 shapes, human-sized, and they were silent. They made it over the fence too, but they sort of stopped there, as if some invisible line held them back. They never spoke, they never advanced, and they just stood there, watching us. We bolted at this point for Mason's house 2 blocks away, and we didn't stop running until his door was locked behind us. My clothes were absolutely soaked now. My wrist felt terrible, and my legs felt like rubber. We sat in the silence for a long time, both trying to catch our breath and also trying to make sense of what that was. But the more that we talked, the less sense that it made. You see, if it had been cops, then they would have announced themselves for sure. If it had been hikers, they would have been out in a downpour with no vehicles nearby, and they definitely wouldn't have chased 2 teenagers through unmarked woods like that. There was no way that it was a group entering from the side trail. We would have seen their lights long before. So, whoever they were already in those woods, already close and seemingly already following too. The worst part, though, for me at least, is that they didn't say a word, not even once. In fact, I didn't even hear them huffing or puffing or anything. Years later, I still avoid that part of town. That patch of forest feels wrong in a way that I struggle to explain now. I mean, nothing supernatural happened, I know that. No vanishing figures, no glowing eyes, no impossible distortions of reality or anything like that. I mean, everything was physical and plausible, but people with unknown intentions, hiding in dark woods in the middle of a storm like that, silently tracking 2 teenagers, that's the kind of real danger that it just never leaves you. And sometimes at night, I think back about those lights weaving through the trees and the feeling that, weirdly enough, if we had hesitated even just for a few seconds longer at that fence, well, maybe we just wouldn't be here. When I think back on the place that I grew up, the first thing that comes to mind isn't the house or the people. It's actually the sheer amount of land around us. A mess of private timber plots, overgrown logging lanes, and half-forgotten boundaries. If you lived anywhere in the upper corner of Washington state, you just sort of accepted that the forest was the real neighborhood, and everything else existed inside of it. My friends and I practically lived out there too. We knew which fallen logs made bridges, where the moss stayed driest after rain, which animal paths looped around creeks. We certainly weren't reckless. We were just products of the place where the woods felt like an extension of your own backyard. But there was one spot none of us ever wanted to test. A sunken, vine-choked structure of an old service road. More of a collapsed cabin than a proper house, I suppose. Locals joked about it though, called it the widow's place, though no one seemed to know where the name came from. The roof sagged so deeply though that the rafters showed through, and the porch had been swallowed by blackberry thickets by now. The door hung sideways as if it had been kicked decades earlier. Even in full daylight, you always felt watch standing near it though. We gave it a wide berth long before we had reasons. Just instinct, I suppose, but we just avoided it. The only thing separating that ruin from our land, though, was a massive tangle of blackberry canes. They grew taller than we were, forming a wall that even the deer avoided. Crossing it wasn't an option. We simply acknowledged that the widow's place was on the other side of it, and whatever belonged there didn't wander onto ours. Now, one weekend, my friend Nora and I discovered a rudimentary platform nailed onto an older tree a bit up the hill. Calling it a treehouse would be way too generous. It was more just a square of old planks and a railing that looked like someone's first attempt at carpentry, really. Still, we climbed up, pretending that it was some secret lookout. From that perch, too, we had a clear view of the land sloping down toward the widow's place. I remember leaning on the railing and seeing, for just a split moment, what looked like someone slipping behind the half-collapsed doorway. Not a figure exactly, but more like unexpected movement in a spot where nothing should have been. Nora saw it too, and we left immediately without discussing it. And it was about a week later that things really escalated. So we were farther north in the woods this day, well within the boundaries of my family's property, climbing 2 separate maples. The trees grew close enough together that we could talk, but high enough that anyone passing underneath wouldn't necessarily notice us or perhaps even hear us. I don't recall what we were talking about, but I only remember the moment that everything just sort of went completely still. No breeze and no birds. Then we heard something down below. We froze and there were footsteps, closer this time. Through the foliage, an elderly man emerged into the clearing. He came from the direction of the widow's place, which shouldn't have been possible unless he had pushed through the blackberry barrier or something. But no one could really do that without shedding blood or losing some clothing. He wore a battered hat with a curled brim, and clothing that looked sun-bleached rather than dirty, cotton worn down to not much left, and his jeans hung loosely, and his boots looked old too, but not in the way of someone who, slept rough or something. More like a man who had owned the same pair for decades and just refused to discard them. He paused beneath our trees, not startled and not searching, but just sort of looking up. "Afternoon," he said, as if he'd expected us. His voice had a flat tone to it, like someone used to talking low and calm. In fact, he sort of sounded like a park ranger or maybe an old farmhand or something from the area. Instantly, though, I just suddenly felt ice cold in my chest. Also, there was no clean line of sight from where he came from to where we were sitting. The undergrowth was way too thick. Had he been following us? Listening to us and watching us? Nora, braver and older than I was, managed to say hello back. The man nodded, tapping one hand against his thigh in an absent, rhythmic way. "You two ought to stay close to the main trails. These woods aren't as forgiving as they look, you know." He didn't sound threatening, but just sort of certain. Before we could respond, he continued walking, angling back down the slope toward the blackberry jungle that separated the land. He didn't seem to slow or turn sideways when he reached it. He simply disappeared between the canes without a sound, no snagging fabric, no cursing, in fact, no noise at all. Nora and I remained silent for a time, both of us gripping our branches so tightly that the bark dug into our palms. When we finally climbed down, we sprinted home without looking back and we left. Now, over the next few weeks, we tried to make sense of it. We kept watching from the edge of the yard with binoculars. Nothing moved around the widow's place. No light, no firewood, no tire tracks on the old service path. The blackberries remained completely untouched as far as we could tell. There wasn't so much as a bent reed or even a footprint to suggest that anyone lived out there, or even walked out there, near to that ruin anyway. We never mentioned the old man to our parents, mind you. We weren't even sure what we would have said, to be honest. A polite stranger told us to be careful, and then walked into an impenetrable thicket like there were air. We knew that it sounded like something that we would have made up to scare each other. And maybe the explanation really is pretty simple. Maybe he lived on the property that we didn't know about. Maybe he cut through a gap in the vines that we never saw. Maybe he spent decades walking the same hidden routes through the woods, using paths that only he knew. That's what I like to tell myself now anyway, because, well, every alternative just seems worse to me. But even with all the rational explanations that I could come up with, I've never really fully shaken the feeling that I had in that tree, of being found by someone that we weren't aware was there, of being seen too easily, and of being warned in a way that felt less like advice and more like a reminder. After that, Nora and I stayed within shouting distance of the house at all times, and if the woods ever grew too quiet like that, or if the air felt strange or heavy or we just got a weird feeling, we always turned around and we just left immediately. People assume the strange things that happen near colleges involve frat boys, bad landlords, or weird neighbors, but the most unnerving situation that I ever fell into started with something, well, painfully ordinary: doing laundry on a Thursday afternoon. Back then, I was finishing my third year of college and living alone for the first time. My apartment complex was small, quiet, and gated, with its own laundry building tucked near the pool. Most tenants were students trying to survive midterms at this stage. The rest were the kinds of families who never really opened their blinds. I barely knew anyone there, in fact. Except for one kid. He called himself B, though everyone knew his real name. He was maybe 10 or 11, awkward haircut, oversized shirts, constantly dragging around a backpack that looked like it belonged to an adult. I would always see him now and then when I was washing my clothes. He always seemed to be waiting for someone to talk to, and if he spotted me, he'd launch into these enthusiastic monologues about school, his friends, the books that he was reading, etc. For a while, it was harmless, kind of sweet even. It reminded me of being that age, too earnest, too excited, and no sense of boundaries whatsoever yet. Eventually, he learned that I was studying English though, and that was when he asked if he could send me some of his short stories. He said that he'd been practicing horror writing and wanted honest feedback from someone older. It felt innocent, so I gave him my email. The stories started coming the same week. Grim little things, runaway animals that talked, empty houses that lured people in, shadowy figures watched through the windows, and they were amateur, but they weren't bad for his age. I didn't always reply, but I'd mention something the next time that I saw him. He always glowed at the attention. Things shifted though the day that he invited me, very seriously, to his elementary school promotion ceremony. I was drowning in finals at the time and couldn't imagine sacrificing a whole morning, so I mailed him a nice card instead. He did not appreciate the gesture. The next time that I ran into him, he looked genuinely offended. "It would have taken you an hour," he muttered. "You spend longer with your friends." It was the first time that I'd heard him speak like that. Quiet, pointed. After that, he stopped talking about school or writing. He started asking weird adult-coded sort of questions instead. One afternoon, with his mother standing right there, he asked if I wanted to have dinner alone with him. When I laughed it off, he doubled down, voice low and insistent. "I just want to get to know you better." All while his mum giggled behind him like the thing was adorable. That was the moment that everything flipped for me too. Not because he was interested. I mean, kids misinterpret relationships all the time, but because he wasn't embarrassed by it at all. He acted like he had a script, and his mother acted like she'd already read it. I backed away after that. I stopped lingering in the laundry room, I stopped answering his emails entirely, and when my short summer session ended, I moved to a new place across town, and I figured that whatever strange dynamic had formed would fizzle out on its own. And for a while, it did. Then, in early October, a plain white envelope showed up in my new mailbox. No return address, my name written in shaky block letters, and inside was a single line. "I hear you walking at night. Do you hear me too?" My stomach dropped. It wasn't just the words, it was the cadence. B's stories always had characters who spoke like that. Dramatic, self-serious, detached from how kids normally communicate. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it wasn't him, and maybe it was a badly executed prank. But then, the second letter came. "You act like things are finished. They're not. I know what you did." That was when I called the police. I felt ridiculous even dialing the number. I mean, there's just no dignified way to say I think a middle schooler is sending me threatening anonymous mail. The officer was polite but pretty much unhelpful. They told me that no law had been broken and that lots of people get letters like that, and that I couldn't assume that it was from anyone that I actually knew. They also pointed out something, though, that still sticks with me today. Most senders of anonymous letters never personally know their recipients. That should have comforted me, but it didn't. I blocked every leftover email associated with B after that. I told the front office for my new complex to hold any envelopes without return addresses. I started taking different routes home, and I also started checking behind me in the parking garages. And then, nothing. No third letter, no emails, no glimpse of him anywhere. It was like someone hit stop on a recording and that was that. My working theory is that he simply got bored or found another adult willing to entertain his imaginative streak. Maybe someone else became his new fixation or something, or maybe he joined a club, or maybe he just forgot I existed. Either way, it was a strange moment in my life, and those letters, they were definitely accurate, and they detailed things that only I knew about. Which really is the creepy part. I mean, how would he have known that unless he was watching me? When I think back on the place where my mother used to shop, it almost feels like remembering a maze rather than a market. The layout was strange. Stores packed tightly together in one stretch, then a long empty gap of shuttered units and broken signs, and finally a large shop sitting by itself as though someone had dragged it a little too far from the rest. As a kid, that gap between the clusters of stores always scared me a bit. It always creeped me out because it was a bit gloomy. Well, I must have been around 9 or 10 the afternoon that this happened. My mum and I had already spent what felt like hours drifting from one tiny shop to another. She liked to take her time comparing prices, pointing things out, doubling back to grab items that she'd already put down. I remember trailing behind her and making shapes with my footsteps on the tile because I was so bored. When we finally headed toward the big shop, the one past the mini market and through the stretch of empty storefronts, I perked up a bit. It was the only place with enough aisles for me to wander around without bumping into someone every 10 seconds. Inside was busier than usual too. People shuffled around with baskets, kids tugged on their parents' sleeves, and the sound of carts scraping against the concrete echoed in a way that made the whole place feel older than it actually was. I didn't notice the man right away. I was too busy drifting between the aisles, poking at things that I had no intention of buying. But then, near the back of the store, I caught sight of him watching me. Not browsing, not waiting for someone, but just watching. Something about him didn't register the way that adults normally do when you're a kid. Kids don't have the vocabulary for off, but they certainly feel it instantly, and I felt it that day. My legs suddenly feeling heavy and feeling frightened, but not exactly knowing why. I pretended to ignore him and wandered back toward the front. When I stepped outside for a moment to get some air, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed by a pair of eyes. And sure enough, when I glanced back through the glass, he was facing me. My mother, she eventually handed me her phone and asked me to go outside and call my uncle, who was supposed to meet us. For obvious reasons, too, I didn't want to leave the store. I didn't want to be anywhere alone in that space behind the mini-market, but I didn't want to make a scene either, so I stepped out and tried to do things quickly. Immediately, like he had been waiting for the cue as well, the man stood up from where he had been lingering near a shelf. It wasn't coincidence, too. He moved the moment that I did. I walked faster, and so did he. I cut across the small parking area, pretending that I needed to tie my shoe so that I could see where he was without turning around. He had shortened the distance between us, walking with this stiff, purposeful motion that just didn't match his age. He didn't even match the environment, in fact. He was dressed in all black and what looked like maybe a suit or something, and it didn't look casual for the place. When his pace quickened again, that was enough for me. I ran. My feet slapped against the pavement so hard that I remember the sound more than the air in my lungs, and I bolted through the empty corridor of an abandoned storefront, the dim walkway stretching ahead of me, and for a second, I thought that I heard his footsteps too, but I didn't dare look. I sprinted past the mini-market, past the benches where the groups usually sat, past the familiar signs that I had seen 100 times before. Everything, though, looked warped by panic, and every car that I passed that wasn't my uncle's made the whole situation just feel so much worse. Then, I saw the familiar dent in the back bumper of his car. I practically dove into the passenger seat too, hand shaking so hard that I fumbled the door handle twice. My uncle looked up in confusion, and all I could manage to say was that Mum needed help carrying bags. I didn't want him asking questions. I didn't want anyone thinking that I was overreacting or just imagining things. We picked her up after that, and we went home, and no one ever heard anything else about that man after that day. I didn't tell my mother what happened. I didn't want her blaming herself or worrying every time that she shopped there. Thinking back on it now, though, I wish that I had told someone because, well, who knows if he ever went after anyone else, and that is a terrible thing to think about. I don't usually talk about this day, mostly because every time that I try to explain it, I can feel myself getting defensive, like I'm preparing for someone to roll their eyes or accuse me of exaggerating or something. But I know what happened, and I know what I felt. I just want to put the memory somewhere outside of my own head, and so that's why I'm here. Now, it was early summer, late June, maybe the third week, and I had taken my kids to one of those big discount toy stores after school. But they had saved up a couple of small gift cards, and it was the kind of simple treat that always made their whole afternoon. They were still in their clothes from school, sweaty from running around all day, excitedly shaking packs of trading cards and clutching cheap little candies. But we weren't in the store that long too, and they picked out what they wanted. We paid, and I walked them back to my car. The parking lot was only half full, the kind of quiet that puts you at ease without realizing it, I suppose. I buckled them in, put their backpacks on the floor, and was just settling into the driver's seat when something felt wrong, in that sort of instantaneous animal instinct sort of way. A faded, older minivan swung into the lane directly in front of my car and angled itself so tightly that I couldn't move. It didn't look like a normal parking maneuver too. It looked deliberate, abrupt, the kind of stop that someone makes when they're trying to make a point. I figured that maybe he wanted the spot beside me or was waiting for someone. Annoyed, yes, but alarmed, not yet. Then the driver's door opened. A man climbed out, somewhere in his late 40s maybe, thin, unshaven, wearing a jacket too warm for the weather. He walked straight up to my window with a kind of boldness that made my stomach drop instantly before I had time to even think. I cracked the window just enough to hear him, but not enough for him to get too close, and he asked about my car. Not friendly curiosity, but like he was reciting lines that he had practiced, watching my reactions. How long have you had it? What did you pay? Did you buy it new? I didn't answer too many of those questions. I just said something polite so that he would leave, and he didn't. He pulled a thumb drive from his pocket, cheap plastic with tape on the side where someone had written a name on it, and it was my first name, spelled correctly, and he held it up like it was some sort of a badge. "Does this belong to you?" he said. "You dropped it." I wasn't sure about that. My kids were in the back seat laughing over their candy wrappers, completely clueless to the situation. He kept going though, and he told me the drive supposedly had images and recordings on it, connected to my family, and that someone else would see them unless I stepped out to talk to him privately. He said my daughter's name, not her full name, but just her first name, and it was enough to make my hand start shaking. I asked him what he was talking about, trying to sound firm instead of terrified, and his expression changed instantly, like flicking a switch. He raised his voice, leaning in closer to the window, telling me not to pretend ignorance and not to make this any harder than what it was. That was the moment that I grabbed my phone. When I started dialing emergency services, he froze. Then, without another word, he spun around and hurried back to his van. As he pulled out of the lane, I noticed him talking rapidly into another phone, glancing into the mirror like he was checking whether I had gotten his license plate or not. As soon as he sped off, I realized something else too. There was another truck. It was grey, older, with tinted windows, and it had been idling behind me the entire time. It rolled out of the lane in sync with the minivan, I think, following at a distance, the two vehicles leaving together like they were part of the same plan. Well, as you can imagine, I didn't wait. I drove out of there and drove home with my kids buckled in, still smiling and still completely oblivious to what was going on. In the end, I didn't tell them anything too. The police showed up later that evening, though. They took down my statement, but the whole time their tone made it clear that they thought that I had blown things out of proportion. No threats were technically made, no physical contact, no property damage, just a concerning interaction, really. Well, that's what they called it anyway. Concerning, but not criminal. And nothing happened afterward. At least, nothing involving the police. But I kept digging on my own because the fear just refused to settle, and a few details did emerge that made everything just feel that much darker as well. So, at the exact moment that the man blocked my car, the grey truck behind me had cut off the lane and I was boxed in without realizing it. I went back and got some footage to see this. That same morning, my email had been accessed from an unfamiliar device. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but thinking back on it now, it was definitely weird. And the dealership where I bought my car, it had taken a photo of me and the kids in the front of it for social media. I had noticed that they posted it with my full name and my license plate visible. Anyone could have found it, really, and anyone could have matched it to me in real life, which obviously explains how somebody got my name. I don't know exactly what the man wanted. I don't know if he was bluffing or if he expected me to panic or follow him or something. What I do know is that everything felt orchestrated, timed, practiced, like he had done something similar before. I tried not to think about what might have happened if I hadn't have locked the doors when I did, or if I had just stepped outside for even a moment, or if my kids had been any slower buckling in, but I don't care how irrational it sounds. That whole event just wasn't random, and I'm convinced that it was planned and that they had something bad in store. Some part of me too still believes that if I hadn't have dialed for help when I did, that the story would have ended completely differently. I hadn't planned on spending the night anywhere except for my dorm. But a last-minute assignment and an early exam convinced my boyfriend and me to crash at his grandmother's place. Her house sits practically around the corner from campus. It wasn't unusual for him to stay there too, but I had not slept over there before, so everything felt a little bit unfamiliar, I guess. The old cupboards that didn't quite close, the hallway lined with framed photographs from like the 70s, the hum of an ancient refrigerator. He and I always had been opposites when it came to anything unexplainable. He grew up Catholic, but treats the supernatural like a campfire story. Fun to hear, but not to believe. I'm not religious at all, but weird coincidences, strange dreams, moments that feel slightly off, I never brushed those aside. And every time that I asked him if he'd ever had an odd, unexplainable experience, he always answered with the same amused shrug. Not once. That's what makes what happened here so strange too. And when we arrived, I went straight to the shower. I had been awake since dawn and just wanted to rinse the day off, really. Meanwhile, he stayed in the kitchen hunting for space in the fridge to stash some Coke for me because he knows that I'll complain later if I don't have something cold to drink before bed. This is where the layout matters too. Now, from the refrigerator, there's a narrow line of sight into a small hallway that sits between the kitchen and the bedrooms. If you stand in exactly that one spot, right in front of the fridge, door open, you can see part of the hallway in the door frames, but not the full rooms. Now, he said that he wasn't thinking about anything at all when it happened. He closed the fridge, turned slightly, and for a split second thought that I had stepped out of the bathroom. He said that he saw a figure leaning partway into the hallway, almost as if someone was craning forward to check who was in the kitchen. He assumed it was me because it was about my height and had something similar to the same color as the shirt that I had been wearing earlier. But what unsettled him wasn't the shape, it was the behavior. He described it as someone who had leaned forward intentionally, like a person peeking around a corner to sort of spy on him. Then, just as gradually as it had appeared, it shifted back, not vanished, but more like it pulled itself out of view. He didn't feel frightened exactly, but said that the air had changed, and it was like he had an odd sensation that you sort of get when you realize that someone had been paying attention to you before you even noticed them. Still thinking it was me, he rushed down the hall and pushed open the bathroom door to ask why I'd stepped out without saying anything. I was still in the shower, shampoo in hair, staring at him like he had lost his mind. And that was when his face changed. He kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe he missaw the shadows. maybe the old house plays tricks with the lighting, or maybe he was just tired or something. He even joked about it later while we were brushing our teeth, but every time the house got quiet again, while we were getting ready for bed, even while he was plugging in his phone, I noticed he kept glancing toward that hallway, like the image had hooked itself into his head. He didn't suddenly become a believer or anything after this, but he certainly admitted that whatever he saw wasn't something that he could easily file away as nothing. And that has stayed with both of us more than the event itself, I suppose. In the end, nothing dramatic ever happened after that. No noises, no figures, no creeping shadows or anything. Just a normal night in an old house, but sometimes normal moments are the ones that bother you the longest, I think. Because if there was something standing there, leaning just far enough to watch him, then the question becomes, how long had it been standing there before he finally noticed? And who exactly was it? When I was about 15, long before I ever had a real job, my favorite way to earn weekend cash was by pushing an old mower. It was just around the neighborhood and I offered cheap yard work. Most people ignored me, but every now and then I'd luck out into a whole lawn for $5 or $10. After a couple of sketchy encounters though, one guy yelling at me to get off of his property and another trying way too hard to coax me inside, I asked my friend to start coming with me. He was older, taller, and happy to split the money with me. We generally stuck to the quiet streets and looked for places where the yard had clearly been left alone for a while. Older folks were our best customers though. They'd usually pay right away and sometimes even toss in a soda, and occasionally ramble about their childhoods, which I found interesting at points. They always told those stories where every winter apparently lasted 6 months and every walk to school involved climbing a snow-buried mountain or something. Anyway, one afternoon in midsummer, after hours of wandering without finding a single taker, we spotted a house that we'd never tried before, older, sagging a bit, with grass up to our shins. From the sidewalk, the place looked untouched for the entire season. Even the hedges had swallowed half the porch rail by now. We hesitated a bit. It had that someone moved out years ago sort of look to it. My friend started backing away, but I pushed him forward, telling him to just knock once and at least try. He shot me a miserable look, and I held up my 2 fingers and mouthed, $10. He sighed and he went. He made it almost to the steps too, before jerking to a halt. I saw him flinch like he had walked into a spider's web. He sort of wheeled around and power walked back to me. "There's someone sitting on the porch," he muttered. "I didn't see him at first." I thought that he was messing with me, so I marched up there myself, acting brave partly because I didn't want him teasing me later. And sure enough, once I got past the overgrown shrubs, I realized that he wasn't lying. A man was sitting on an old wooden chair, tucked behind a tangle of branches. He looked to be well into his 70s. His overalls were faded to a sort of pale stripe pattern, and his shoes looked like something a grandfather would wear to church, if he couldn't find anything else, that is. His shoulders, they slumped forward as if he had been carved into that position. His face, it wasn't frightening exactly, but just sort of drained of expression. His eyes were cloudy, unfocused, staring across the yard as though he were waiting for something to reappear. Sir?" I asked, but there was nothing. I tried louder again, but still nothing. My friend nudged me at this point, whispering that we should just forget about it and leave. I was about to turn around too when the man suddenly rose up. Not fast, slowly, stiffly, like he was lifting himself out of a habit rather than intention. He didn't say a word though. He glanced at me, then at my friend, his eyes milky and strangely distant. Then he stepped inside the house and closed the door without a sound. We exchanged a bit of a look. My friend wanted to leave immediately, and I said that we should wait a minute. I mean, maybe he was getting money or wanted us to follow. He reluctantly agreed, though he couldn't stop mentioning the man's eyes. I told him lots of older people had cataracts, they were going blind, things like this, trying to sound confident for both of us. We started half joking about how we would split the money when a sharp crack rang out from inside of the house. Not a pop, but more like a heavy board snapping or something slamming really hard. We both jumped from it, frightened. Then instincts took over and we ran full speed down the street, abandoning the mower, the gas can, everything. By the time that we reached the corner, we'd convinced ourselves that we might have actually heard a gunshot. Neither of us wanted to go back. We knocked on the closest house and asked the woman living there to call the police. Even she said that she hadn't seen anyone come or go from that house in a long time. A whole swarm of officers arrived, though. They treated it like a possible weapons call at first, but the longer that they stood in the yard, the more their expressions sort of shifted. The grass, the smell, the peeling paint. They started talking quietly amongst themselves about doing a welfare check. When they stepped inside, we waited on the curb. They weren't in there for long too. 2 officers returned, though, looking pretty unsettled. "You boys sure this happened today?" one asked us. We both said yes. They kept repeating the question, though, clearly confused. An unmarked car showed up soon after. A detective went inside ahead of us. When he finally returned, he walked over and crouched in front of us like we were much younger than we actually were, and he asked again what we saw, how the man looked, what he was wearing. Then he asked more than once if we'd gone inside the house at any point. We said no every time. Finally, he exhaled through his nose and said, "Look, what you described doesn't match what's in there. There's an elderly man inside, and he was wearing the clothes that you mentioned, but based on his condition, he's been dead for months." My friend stared at him like he had misheard everything. I personally felt a little bit dizzy. The detective didn't say much else after that, only that the man had likely died alone during the winter and hadn't been found for a long time. The loud noise that we'd heard, well, it might have been something falling somewhere in the old house, or even a car backfiring on a nearby street or something. They couldn't say. But whatever we thought that we saw on that porch, apparently it was not someone alive. The police, they retrieved our mower and gas can and they handed them back to us. And after that, neither of us ever tried yard work again. In fact, we didn't go near that street again either. I'll never forget the face of that old man on that porch, and just how weird this whole experience was. I didn't grow up believing much in campus folklore, so when I moved to Ashford, a small college town in northern Michigan, I thought the spooky rumors surrounding Northridge College were just part of the campus culture. Every school seems to have its own collection of stories, right? Usually exaggerated, occasionally recycled from somewhere else. Still, a few of the older buildings at Northridge felt noticeably heavier than the rest, I'll admit. Like they carried a kind of stillness that the newer things didn't have. Ashford itself had a strange history too. Before the town expanded, parts of the land were used as scattered burial plots for logging families who couldn't afford formal cemeteries, apparently. Later, when the town finally established a proper burial ground, many of the older graves were relocated, sometimes hastily and not always with complete records too, which is a bit of a bummer. Local historians claim that some of the original resting sites ended up underneath what eventually became the central campus. Whether or not that's true, the belief has stuck around long enough to shape a few unsettling stories. That much is clear. Now, one of the most persistent legends involves Baker Hall, a squat brick building tucked behind the science complex. It's mostly used for faculty offices now, but decades earlier it housed freshman dorms. The rumor goes that during renovations in the late 1940s, workers uncovered the remains of a child somewhere near the boiler room. The details? They vary wildly depending on who tells it. Some versions say that the remains predated the college entirely. Others claim that the child had been lost during one of the grave relocations from early town expansion. Official Campbell archives, though, make no mention of any of this. Students still whisper, though, about a small figure that occasionally appears in the lower windows at night. A few custodians do rounds alone in the basement after dark. People laugh at it, but nobody really volunteers to go down there for fun, so I suppose that says something. I didn't give any of it much thought. Well, until one late afternoon when a friend and I decided to explore the building at one point, and we weren't ghost hunting or anything, just cutting through the campus between classes and curious enough to take a bit of a detour. My friend joked that we should check out the basement since everyone made such a big deal about it. I'd only ever been in Baker Hall during office hours when the place felt normal enough. But the moment that we reached the bottom of the basement stairs, something felt off immediately. The lights that normally flickered on with motion stayed dark. The hallway ahead was barely visible except for the faint emergency bulbs, which cast everything into a sticky yellow tint. The air felt weirdly cooler than the rest of the building too, like sharply so, like stepping into an unheated garage in winter. My friend, they didn't seem bothered by this. She trotted ahead, disappearing behind a turn in the corridor after saying that she'd scout it out. I stayed where I was, uneasy without knowing why. The basement, it was silent, but not in a normal way. It was weirdly silent, like it was muffled or something. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that somebody else was in the hallway, even though I couldn't hear or see anything. I was just about to call out to my friend too, when something brushed against the back of my shoulder. Not a shove and not a draft, but an intentional touch. It was gentle, quick, but unmistakably deliberate. I spun around so fast that I almost slipped. The hallway behind me, though, it was empty. Right as my pulse started to spike, my friend screamed from around the corner. She burst back into sight and sprinted toward me without looking back, and I turned and followed. We didn't stop as well until we were outside and halfway across the quad. When she finally caught her breath, she told me that she had apparently heard footsteps racing toward her, hard, rapid, and close, coming from the far end of the basement where the hallway dead-ended into a concrete wall. She said that it didn't sound like echo or pipes settling. It sounded like someone running in a straight line at full speed. We went over what each of us had experienced, but neither of us could piece it together. No shadows, no voices, no proof of anything unusual. Just the timing, her footsteps, and my shoulder being touched happening nearly at the same moment. We didn't bother reporting anything. The college already dismissed most student complaints as overactive imaginations, especially when it came to the older buildings. We also didn't go back to Baker's Hall basement again, that much was for sure. I still don't think that we saw any kind of ghost or anything, but whatever happened down there, it didn't feel like a typical creepy building moment either. It felt intentional and almost like a warning, but delivered without words. I used to spend a lot of weekends wandering the scrub behind Lake Coorong, mostly because it was quiet and partly because I was doing small environmental surveys for a postgraduate project. It certainly wasn't glamorous work, mostly photographing lichen growth, logging tree types, that sort of thing, but it got me out of the city and gave me an excuse to stay with an old family friend who owned a tiny shack near the water here. One afternoon in the early winter as well, the sun was dropping fast and the air was already going cold, and I was walking along a narrow drainage gully when I noticed movement down by the reeds. At first, I thought that maybe it was just an animal. Whatever it was, though, it stood sort of half hidden, perfectly still. Then it sort of straightened in this strange, deliberate way. Too fluid for an animal and way too tall for a person. I couldn't make out the features because the shadows under the trees were way too thick, but I noticed the shape didn't turn like a human would. Instead, it sort of shifted its whole upper body, stiff and slowly, as if its spine didn't bend in the way that ours does. I remember thinking, don't stare, but of course I did. The thing leaned slightly, almost curiously, and there was no sound, no breathing that I could hear anyway. Just the awareness that something was observing me in a way that felt clinical. And then, without warning, it stepped back and the reeds swallowed it completely. Not running, but like it had slipped behind a curtain. I convinced myself that it must have just been a trick of the light mixed with exhaustion. I mean, I'd been out there far too long, cold and hungry, and the mind does weird things when you're alone like that. By the time that I got back to the shack, I had half convinced myself too that nothing had happened. But the next night, everything about that theory came undone. You see, I'd fallen asleep on the couch while going over data sheets, only to snap awake with a primal jolt, like something had leaned over me. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, at first at least. I just had the unmistakable sense of being sort of surrounded. The shack has this sort of thin carpeting over old floorboards, and when somebody walks, you can really hear it flex. And I swear to this day that the boards creaked in 4 distinct places around me, not moving, but just sort of shifting weight, the way that people do when they're standing way too close and trying not to make noise. I stayed absolutely still, and eventually I reached over and flicked on the lamp. But the room, it was empty. No footprints, no open doors, in fact, nothing disturbed. Except, and this part makes me sound ridiculous, I know, but the chairs around the little dining table had been pulled out, all at sort of slightly odd angles as well. Almost like people had been sitting in them in a moment earlier and stood way too quickly. Well, as you can probably imagine, I didn't really sleep after that. And I guess the strangest thing, though, is that nothing else ever really came of it. No follow-up sighting, no nightmares, no missing time, no grand revelation or anything. Just 2 moments like that. One in the gully and one in the shack, and it just all felt wrong in a way that I still cannot name. But the only part that sticks with me after all of these years, though, is the posture of whatever I saw by the reeds that day, and the silent pressure of being watched the next night. I eventually finished everything, and I stopped going out to that lake alone, and genuinely, I was grateful for that. In late 2023, I was renting a small cottage just outside of a rural town in the south. The place was quiet in that sort of still way that old country roads can be. My neighbors, they were spread out far enough that I couldn't hear them unless they were mowing their lawns, and even then it sounded like it came from behind a hill. Most nights it was just the hum of the fridge, really, my footsteps and my own thoughts. I'd been living there for maybe 6 months before the atmosphere started to feel, well, just a little bit weird, I suppose. Not haunted, exactly, just wrong in some subtle and sort of persistent ways. Like, you know how sometimes you walk into a room and feel like someone just stepped out of it, even when you watch the room for like the last half hour? That's how this house was. Like it always had one more occupant than I could account for. I tried ignoring the feeling, People imagine things when they live alone, right? And I didn't want to be dramatic about it. But one night, it turned the unease into something that I couldn't rationalize away anymore. So it was late, past midnight, when I finally shut down my laptop and got ready for bed. My cat, Maya, had already curled up in her usual spot under the dresser. I was about halfway through brushing my teeth when I heard a sound from the living room. It wasn't loud and not even alarming at first, just a short, heavy tap like someone setting down a wooden object on the floor. I paused, toothbrush still in hand. There was another tap, same rhythm, same weight behind it. I assumed that Maya had knocked something over, so I dried my face and walked toward the doorway. But the further that I moved down the hall, the more that I realized that the sound wasn't random. It was spaced evenly, like someone knocking with the knuckle of a single finger. There was a tap, then a pause, then a tap and a pause again. For a moment, I thought that it might be coming from the porch, so I leaned slightly toward the front windows to listen. And that's when I heard a voice. It didn't call my name, and it didn't even sound like somebody that I knew, but the tone was familiar enough to jolt something deep in my memory. It sounded like an older woman, gentle, almost soothing, saying a soft, drawn-out hello, as if expecting me to answer. It didn't make any sense to me. My closest neighbors were a retired man who barely spoke above a whisper, and the house across the road was empty. Nobody was visiting, and nobody had any reason to be outside at that hour. I stood absolutely still. I didn't go to the door, didn't look through the blinds, and I just listened. There was another hello, this time drawn closer, like the speaker, whoever they were, had leaned toward the doorframe. Then the knocking resumed, but this time lighter, testing, almost cautious, I would say. A sinking feeling hit me in a way that is hard to explain. It wasn't fear of a person. I know what kind of fear that feels like. This was different. It was a sensation that I've only felt a handful of times in my life. The instinct that whatever was at my door wasn't there for a normal reason. I backed away quietly, hoping that the floorboards wouldn't creak and give my position away. Maya slid out from under the dresser and stared toward the living room with her ears flat, like she already knew something that I didn't. I didn't try to speak to it. I didn't try to reason. Instead, I went room to room, shutting every interior door and checking the windows without letting myself look outside. I didn't turn on the lights either. I didn't want to signal anything. For maybe 5 minutes, too, the knocking and that strange coaxing voice continued. Then, gradually, very gradually, both faded away. Mind you, I listened for a car engine or something, but there was nothing. Just silence, deep and sort of absolute. I waited almost an hour before finally checking the front porch, and when I did, no one was there. The gravel driveway wasn't disturbed. The dew on the porch railing was completely untouched. Even the doormat had sort of settled into that undisturbed, slightly uneven shape that it did every morning. In other words, nothing looked out of place. Now, if I hadn't have heard it with my own ears, I would have thought that I imagined the whole thing. And life went on after that. In fact, the cottage never had another incident. I still don't know what to call it, and I only know that I'm grateful that I didn't open the door.